And we had just read through the last comment on the first verse from Deuteronomy, where your translator writes numerous, and I said that might not be the right translation. And we considered the quotation from the book of Ezekiel about the young woman who is unclothed and wallowing in her blood. We said downtrodden is not a good translation. She's wallowing in her blood. And the prophet says, he addressed her, through your blood shall you live, through your blood shall you live, which is all in the verse. And the question was raised, why is it said twice? Now, throughout the Tanakh, repeating something is a matter of emphasis. So you can say it in simple terms, just emphasizing it, making it prominent, making it something of extreme importance. But it's really, in a certain sense, worse than that. As my Rabbi Zatzal pointed out, the word in Hebrew is not blood, but bloods. It's not damech, which would be your blood. It's damayech, which is damim shalach. And damim is plural. So each time it says two, and it says it twice, which is really four. I don't know any of the written commentaries who point this out, but that's the strict reading of it. So my Rebbe explained it as follows. The first verse, which says, through your bloods you shall live, refers, as the classical explanation is, to the two bloods that took place on the day before Pesach, the blood of circumcision and the blood of the Paschal sacrifice. That's what we explained yesterday. But now those two are contained in one verse. And we have another verse. And he associated, I think he found Chafetz Chaim like this. He associated the word dam to the word dom, which means to be silent. When Aaron's two children died on the day of dedicating the tabernacle, next week's parsha, it says Vayidom Aaron. He was quiet. It's the same letters, Daled Mem. And just as Aaron was silent in the face of that tragedy, so we too sometimes have to be silent in the face of the tragedies that we confront. There is a quote from the Chafetz Chaim. If I remember correctly, this is in a sefer by Rav Eli Lopian, but I might be wrong, where he said that there will be a time of oppression just before the Mashiach comes, and the oppression will take place in the land of Israel, and the only response that we will have available is silence, accepting it in silence. Now, accepting it in silence doesn't mean you don't pray to God for salvation. It just means no complaint. No complaint. And that would be the other two uses of Daled Mem, one for Aaron and one for later generations. But anyway, whatever you're going to say about it, you do have to take account of the fact that these words are plural. Okay, on to the next verse from Deuteronomy. The Egyptians, now here your translator is taking sides on an ambiguity. Now I will read it to preserve the ambiguity of the words. I would read it this way. The Egyptians eviled us and deprived us and imposed hard labor upon us. Let's take one at a time. Vayoreu, the root of that word is ra. Ra means evil. Literally, simplistically, on the surface, and ambiguously, they eviled us. That could be one of two things, and both meanings are brought in the commentaries. One is, they did evil to us by punishing us, hurting us in certain ways. The other meaning that word could have is they made us evil. They eviled us. They made us evil. And indeed, the commentators say, had the second not been correct, the first couldn't have been true. Had we lived up to the challenges of life in Egypt, had we not sunk to idol worship and other degradations, then they wouldn't have had the leverage to punish us, to cause us to suffer. But because they were successful in making us evil, so therefore they were successful in doing evil to us. So the right thing to do, I think, is to have both of those meanings in mind. The second word I told you yesterday before, when they write afflicted, it's typically not correct. La'anos, ayin, nun, hey in Hebrew, means to deprive. It does not signify suffering. It just means to be deprived. That's why when that word appears on Yom Kippur, it doesn't mean you have to suffer on Yom Kippur. It just means you don't have the normal range of inputs and resources available to you. So that's the correct translation. And then they put upon us hard work. No question, that's correct. So now, let's take the analysis of the verse by associating it with places in the book of Exodus. The Egyptians did evil to us. As it says, let us deal with them wisely, lest they multiply. And if we happen to be at war, they may join our enemies and fight against us and then leave the country. Now I'm going to call upon a little amount of specialist knowledge here. The projection of the Egyptians as to what's going to happen with the Jews is, on the surface, utterly unrealistic. It's utterly unrealistic. Anybody know why? What about this projection that the Jews are going to do is utterly unrealistic?
They're enslaved people.
So that would make it realistic. They'll get an opportunity to leave and they'll leave.
If they were successful, they would drive the Egyptians out, not leave the country.
Not only that, that's correct, that's what Rashi says, not only that, but they aren't enslaved. They are not enslaved. This verse is the invitation of the Egyptians to set up the slavery. When this verse is uttered, they're not slaves yet. Why then would anyone dream that they're planning to leave? On the contrary, if they would join a foreign power and be supportive in a successful conquest of Egypt, they would take over. They wouldn't leave. And that being the case, when they say that they would leave the country, this is a stylistic feature which is found a number of times in the Tanakh, where someone is talking about what may happen, and he really means, I'm in danger, this may happen to me, but you don't say that it's going to happen to me. You don't verbalize that. You say it indirectly. So he says they'll leave the country. What he really meant was, they'll chase us out of the country. And they, now it says afflicted, I said it's deprived. Watch this, this is a very important verse. As it says, they set upon us taskmasters, officials of taxes, in order to oppress or afflict or deprive them with their burdens. And they built Pisgah and Ramses as treasure cities for Pharaoh. Look carefully at the verse and answer me this question. Are the Egyptians looking for free slave labor for their industrial projects? How do you know? You waved your head no. How do you know?
That's not the argument that they put forth.
Well, okay, but in this verse, it's absolutely explicit. What does the verse say? They set taskmasters over them in order to oppress them. Not in order to get free labor, but in order to oppress them. The way in which they oppressed them was only for the sake of making them despair, depriving them of energy, of initiative. And by the way, I have to mention this because I hear this all the time. The text is quite clear. We're not talking about building pyramids here. How many times have I received emails that with no record whatsoever that the Jews built the pyramid, so the Torah has to be wrong? It doesn't say that. It says it built treasure cities. Pyramids were not used as treasure cities. Okay, now the Midrash goes to town here. The Egyptians hired industrial psychologists to ask, what kinds of forced labor will cause these people to become depressed and lack initiative and energy. And one part of their strategy was to make men do women's work and women to do men's work. You don't get efficient production that way. You don't get high quality production that way, but the person lacks even pride in his workmanship. I want to tell you a story here which I found really astounding when I read it. There's a wonderful book called To Vanquish the Dragon, which is a story about the experiences, the bravery, the Kiddush Hashem of Beis Yaakov girls in the Holocaust. And one girl writes that she was an excellent seamstress, so when she worked in the factory, she was able to produce more than her normal quota, and she hid extra garments so that on Shabbos she pretended to work, and when the overseer came by to check her production, she took out one of the garments that she had completed during the previous 6 days. And in that way, she was able to avoid working on Shabbos. And she writes, my garments were good. They were top quality. They couldn't complain since I did them fast, they couldn't complain that they got low quality. No, I'm an excellent seamstress, and I did it fast enough to protect. Now, of course, that's heroism. If she were caught doing that, she'd been killed. And she was doing it for the sake of Shabbos. But notice that she did have pride in her ability to do that. The Egyptians were smarter than the Nazis. They said, we don't even want you to have pride in your workmanship. So women should lay bricks and men should bake or something. So the job you'll do will be a poor job, a poor quality job, and you won't even be able to take pride in the workmanship that you're doing.
Isn't there something else of depression that happened? Ramses means that it falls down.
Yeah, okay, that's, okay, yeah. But I'm not doing that level of medrash. Okay, they imposed hard labor upon us. Says the Egyptians declared the children of Israel with hard labor. I don't know what I can tell you a hint. The word hard labor in Deuteronomy is avodah kasha, which means hard labor. And the quotation from the book of Exodus is forech, which can mean hard labor, but it does contain a hint. I'll tell you the hint, and as I tell you the hint, you should try to associate in your mind where such a hint would be recorded. In what kind of piece of Jewish literature would this hint be recorded? There is a coding that the Talmud uses on occasion called the Atbash coding. Atbash coding means the Aleph and the Tuf are associated, the Beis and the Shin coming in from the outside, from the beginning and end, associating the letters. And where you use that coding, you just switch the letters according to the Atbash association. So, Pei is 6 letters from the end of the alphabet, which would be corresponding to Vav. Resh is 3 from the end, which would be corresponding to Gimel. Chaf is 12 from the end, which then means you've gone over the middle point. So then you've got to take Kaf is 12 from the end, right? So then it's going to be associated with Lamed coming from the beginning, because it's over the middle point. Okay, now we have 3 letters, Vav, Gimel, and Lamed. Now let's try the numerical values of those letters. Numerical value of a Vav is 6. Numerical value of a Gimel is 3. And numerical value of a Lamed is 35. Grand total of 39. 39. Is that a number that has association somewhere? Is that something that, plays a large role in Jewish thinking? It does in a few places, but one of the grand places is the 39 forbidden activities on Shabbos, 39 malachos. This author that I'm quoting says, from this you see that the Egyptians caused the Jews to act in all of the 39 categories of labor that are forbidden on Shabbos and were used for the construction of the tabernacle. And there's a message here that these are the basic levels of physical creativity, and they can be used as an instrument of slavery. They can be used as the production of the tabernacle, And Shabbos is so holy that you can't even use those activities of physical creativity for the production of the tabernacle on Shabbos. Fine. Who would make a remark like this? First using the Atbash coding, and then using gematria to arrive at 39. What kind of traditional Jewish literature would you find such an idea in? Well, I'm speaking to you, and I'm also speaking to the people who are either listening or watching the recording. Maybe a natural association would be the Hasidic movement, Hasidic ideas, or maybe Kabbalistic ideas, and so on and so on. The author of that comment is Tosfos. Tosfos. Very sober, very logical, very precise and scholarly. Tosfos, in the last chapter of Masechet Pesachim, Tosfos brings this pshat. At any rate, maybe that's what's when the Haggadah takes the words avodah kasha, which literally mean hard labor, and associated with a verse that has the word pei reish chaf in it, vorech, maybe that's hinted. Fine. We cried out to Hashem, the God of our fathers. Hashem heard our cry, saw our, again, only affliction or deprivation, our burden and our oppression. And here there's a serious problem, a serious theological problem. Reading the verse simplistically, it says, we cried out, and Hashem saw our affliction, our burden, etc. Makes it sound like it's our crying out that causes him to see. Makes it sound like if we hadn't cried out, he wouldn't have seen. Now, of course, that's nonsense. God sees everything. At any moment, he sees the sum total of the past, present, and future. Nothing's missing. Doesn't require anybody to cry out to get God to see it. Ramchal talks about this in the Derech Hashem, and he says, doesn't talk about it in great detail, but he does mention the principle that psychological verbs like see, like hear, like know, are not, when you describe God, are not used to describe his sensation or his thinking or picking up information. They are used to describe God's decisions and action. They're used to describe his decisions and action. Now, the secularly minded, independent, perfectly logical critic will say, you're making that up just to get out of the problem. Okay, let me give you a proof that the Hebrew language is used this way even with respect to people, let alone with respect to God. In the book of Esther, the book starts with the story of the banquet that Achashverosh made, and his ordering Vashti make an appearance, and she refused, and she was deposed. At least, Midrash says she was killed. Beginning of chapter 2, it says, Achashverosh remembered what happened, remembered what was decreed against Vashti. He remembered. Now, how are we supposed to understand this? Imagine Achashverosh strolling the palace with his aides and saying, I haven't seen Vashti in months. I wonder where she is. She's in Acapulco running up the credit card. So that's where she is. No, I forgot. It slipped my mind. Yeah, we threw her out. We deposed her. Probably not, right? He probably didn't forget. So what does the book mean by saying he remembered? Remember doesn't mean you became conscious of something which slipped your mind. That certainly isn't true about Achashverosh, a flesh and blood person. It means now is the time to get a new queen. So the fact that he threw Vashti out is now the motivation for the next sequence of actions. If that's true for a human being, it certainly can be true for God. When you say that God remembers, or you ask God to remember, you're not saying, gee, God, I know that sometimes things, you have a lot to manage. And sometimes slip out of your notice and, could be lost. So please make a note of this because I don't want you to remember, I forget this. That's not what's going on. What's going on is you, of course, always remember everything, but not always is everything in the past a reason for what you're doing at the moment. It might not be relevant what you're doing at the moment. I want this to be relevant. When I ask you to remember the patriarchs, I want the closeness and commitment you have to the patriarchs to be relevant now and always to what you do, because you'll deal with us in a favorable way, therefore. So here, when it says God saw their pain, it doesn't mean that in the 90 years prior to now, he didn't see their pain? Of course he saw their pain. But that wasn't time to do something about it. And now came the time to do something about it. Okay, let's see what the associations are that the Haggadah brings to the verses in the Exodus. We cried out to Hashem, the God of our fathers, as it says, it happened in the course of those many days that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel groaned because of the servitude and cried. They cried because of the servitude rose up to God. Medrash here says an obvious thing. By the way, this is in contemporary life is exactly the same, that you couldn't cry out. You couldn't cry out because crying out because of the servitude would be regarded as treason, disloyalty to the government. But when the king of Egypt died and everybody was mourning the king of Egypt, everybody was crying, the Jews were crying because of the oppression. They could do that. Where is there a country in the world today where this is strictly enforced? North Korea. No one can complain, no one can cry, no one can express any dissatisfaction. But when the previous dictator died, everybody was crying. So of course people were crying. And then they could cry because of the terrible oppression that they're suffering. That's in force even today. Okay, Hashem heard our cry. As it says, Hashem heard their groaning, and God recalled his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Here there lies a deep idea, which is due to the Gaon of Vilna. If you look through the Exodus, you'll see over and over again, God took the Jewish people out because of the covenant with the patriarchs. When we spoke at the beginning about freedom, we talked about the fact that it was not because God's committed to political freedom and rights and all the rest, certainly not, because of the covenant. Let's see, does that covenant apply to all biological descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Or let's say of Jacob? Is that how it applies in history? The answer is no. Just having the right genes isn't enough. I'll prove it to you. When the Jews worship the golden calf, God says to Moses, I've had it with them. I'm going to wipe them out, and I'll make a new nation out of you. Did I make a promise to the patriarchs? Sure I did. I sure did. But I'll wipe out the whole population, and I'll start over again. I'll start over again with you, and in a few hundred years, we'll have another nation. When they have the sin of the spies, he says it to Moses again, I'll wipe them all out and I'll make a nation out of you. And even in Egypt, the Midrash says that 80% of the Jews who were in Egypt died in Egypt at this point. Only 20% went out. So the covenant doesn't apply to everyone with the right genes. To whom does it apply? Says the Gaon, I'm paraphrasing, says the Gaon of Vilna, it applies to those who represent the covenant. They have to represent the covenant. There has to be something in their attitudes and their behavior that shows that they relate to the covenant. Now, as we said a couple of times, the level of assimilation in Egypt was horrific. Many of the Jews were idol worshippers at the time. So, says the Gaon of Vilna, God caused the oppression to become more severe so as to stimulate them to cry out to God. And when they cry out to God, then they are relevant to the covenant, and then they can be saved. This is a good example of, first of all, how God works behind the scenes. Second of all, it's a good example of how, when you see things happening, you don't know why they're happening. When the oppression becomes more and more severe, a natural reaction, dead wrong, but a natural reaction is God has abandoned us, or God says we are evil and we have to be punished, and so forth and so on. The purpose of the increased suffering can be the exact opposite. It's a necessary condition for you to be worthy of being saved. So that's what this said. God heard our cry, as it says, Hashem heard their groaning, and because he heard their groaning, he called the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Not to relieve their pain. They were in pain beforehand, suffering unjustly beforehand. But because it reached the level that caused them to cry out, and because they cried out, then he heard their pain. You want to say something?
Going back to what you were saying about the covenant and going to happen spies, etc. Wouldn't by that logic, if no Jew is connected to the covenant in the way that you're talking about, wouldn't God still have to have at least one Jew left over, even if he did a mass wiping out?
Yes, but of course he can arrange that there should be one. By the way, he governs that person's development and governs that person's conditions of life. Okay, you saw our affliction, Amalenu, right? This disruption of family life, as it says, God saw the children of Israel and he knew. There's a little bit of a hint here. No, I'm mixed up. Sorry, this is Onyenu. That's the same affliction that he said before. Okay, this was our sense of loss. Our burden, that's Amalenu, refers to the children. As it says, every son that is born to you is cast in the river, every daughter you should let live. That's very interesting that this idea of the male children dying is attributed to the word Amal. Amal in Hebrew indicates labor that has no fruits. Labor that has no fruits. So here it works very well. This is the children who were drowned. A woman is pregnant for 9 months, and the baby's born, and they start to provide for the child, and then all of that investment comes to nothing. As a famous remark of the Chafetz Chaim, when a person finishes a tractate of the Talmud, there's a long declaration that he makes, and one tiny section of it is, Anu amelim v'hem amelim, we put forth effort, and they, those who don't invest in studying Torah, put forth effort. Anu amelim v'kabel schar, we put forth effort and receive reward. Hem amelim v'ein v'kabel schar, they put forth effort and don't receive reward. So the Chafetz Chaim asked, let's say we're talking about a shoemaker. Okay, he's not learning Torah. Why would you say that he puts forth effort and doesn't receive reward? He makes shoes and he gets paid for the shoes. Why is this the statement a tribute to the one who's not learning Torah, putting forth a lot of effort and getting no reward? Now, in the days of the Chafetz Chaim, it wasn't like today where you walk into a store that has 400 pairs of shoes ready to sell. In those days, you walked to a shoemaker and he measured your foot and then he created a pair of shoes for you special. Now imagine that he measures your foot, cuts and sews the leather, and you come in to put it on and it doesn't fit. What are you going to do? Are you going to pay him? Definitely not. Definitely not. Now, let's compare that to studying Torah. Suppose you're working on a certain text of Torah and you put in effort of time, hours and hours, together with your study partner, and you don't get it. You don't get it. You just don't understand it. Do you get reward for that? Yes, you do. Because the mitzvah of Torah study is to be involved in Torah study. La'asok b'divrei Torah. And you were involved. So that's the difference between Torah study and other types of productive activity. But what it shows is that the word amal in both cases means effort that ends with no results. And that's what you have here. You have effort that ends with no results because the children were drowned. Lachatzenu, tchak. I have nothing to say about that. It says another word for pressure. Hashem took us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and outstretched arm with great awe, signs, and wonders. Here we have to do a little work. Took us out with a strong hand, mighty hand. Strength. We're attributing strength to the Creator. What kind of strength might that be? The Torah has to specify that that's how he took us out. What is strength? Can anybody define what strength is?
It says in Pirkei Avot, the strong man is.
Yeah, it's true, but I want a definition of strength. That's an application of the concept, as you'll see. There, I would say he was truly strong. It's a very narrow application. The concept of strength is much broader than that. No one could say, because of that statement in Pirkei Avos, that strength has nothing to do with muscles. Nothing to do with muscles. What is strength? It's the ability to overcome resistance. Strength is the ability to overcome resistance. Fine. So now God is strong. God's hand is strong. He can overcome resistance. What kind of resistance would be relevant to the creator of the universe? Too many galaxies? I mean, he's making them. What kind of resistance could possibly be relevant to the creator of the universe, where it will be relevant to say, oh, but he's strong, he can overcome that resistance? Now here you have to really think carefully. Think a little bit outside the box. What kind of resistance could it be possible to say about God, yeah, there's resistance, but he can overcome it?
A choice, our bechira, to do it.
Okay, a little bit, but it's not going to do the job entirely. What? It's hard for God to overcome human bechira? Hard to do that? I mean, God engineers the deaths of almost all people, and their bechira stops, right? God has no trouble in overcoming human bechira. When Yerovam wanted to offer a sacrifice, he lost control of his hand, right? God had no lack of power to overcome human bechira. Your remark is in the right direction, but it needs refining until it can be taken on board. Yeah.
When a certain judgment would be the just thing to do in the eyes of God, where it would be emes, but he overcomes that decision and goes for another route. So it's hard to overcome emes, but he does it anyways for mercy or something like that.
Okay, I think that's right. And I hope, as I will say it in slightly different words, it's what you're thinking of. The resistance that's relevant to God is internal resistance. It's his own resistance. And then you're talking about one aspect of his action, his principles for dealing with the world, overcoming another of his own principles. That's significant resistance. Nothing outside of God could have significant resistance. Now, and that indeed is what strong means. Strong then refers to a particular principle of action, and it's strong because it can overcome another competing principle of action. Now, this is a strategy. This is a strategy. When you have to talk about God, sometimes, maybe even always, you don't talk about God because God is beyond all talk. What you talk about is his principles of action. This makes God talk refer to many, not one. That's a tricky, subtle theological position to be in. I mean, we are the ones who brought monotheism to the world. Monotheism is true, but that leaves us speechless, because nothing we can say about that one. So instead of talking about that one, we talk about the things that he does, and he does many things, or at least the way in which he does them, he has communicated to us as according to a number of different principles. And then you open up a whole realm of flexibility for understanding many things that are said about God. Let's go back to your definition. The Mishnah says, who is powerful? The one, and by the way, it's not the same word for powerful. That's gibor, and here it's chazak. But okay. Who is powerful? The one who conquers his own spirit. Now, that word is gibor. That word is used for human beings, and it's used for God also. Conquers his own spirit? Are we going to say that about God? So you could squeeze out and say, look, this is a Mishnah. The Mishnah is talking about people. Well, when you say that the Mishnah is talking about God, you could do that. You can hear in my voice and in my vocabulary that I wouldn't be very happy with that. But if you were desperate, you could do that. But the Mishnah is defining a term. It's telling you what gibor means. Ideally, that ought to be the meaning of it when it applies to people, when it applies to God, because in our literature it applies both ways. But if you now think of, for people, you overcome your own spirit. Okay, so there's something in you called your spirit, and there's something in you that's doing the overcoming of the spirit. It's not overcoming itself. That's nonsensical. So you say, yeah, sure, because the person splits up. No question. The person splits up. Good inclination, evil inclination, various types of motivation. We know that. Could God split up also? And the first thought is, no, God is unity. We're monotheists. But if you take the idea of talking about God's active principles, and this is what is done throughout the Kabbalah, and this is also what is done in that greatest of all Jewish philosophical works, the Moreh Nevuchim, the Haggadah of the Perplexed, part 1, chapter 54, where his words are echoed by Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto almost word for word in one of his Kabbalistic essays. And he did it on purpose because he follows the Rambam many times. So the idea that when you talk about God, you're talking about one of these active principles, then you can see God as split into these different principles, and you talk about one conquering the other, and you can say it literally. This also applies, as my oldest son pointed out to me, I had a terrible problem. When you talk about God being holy, what is holiness? For everything other than God, holiness means, to say an item is holy, means that it is in a special relationship with God, and because it's in that special relationship, it has certain special restrictions and certain special requirements. Whether you talk about an offering in the temple which is holy, or you talk about the temple itself that's holy, or you talk about a Torah scroll that's holy, or you talk about the Jewish people that are holy, every one of them is in a special relationship with God, and that special relationship dictates for it a special type of treatment. The essence of holiness is being in a special relationship with God, and the consequences of it is certain types of treatment. That's great. Then I thought to myself, okay, so what does it mean to say that God is holy? That's where I buckled. What? God's going to be, what, in a relationship to something else? And that's going to give God special treatment and so on and so on. I mean, that's nonsensical, absolutely nonsensical. What disappointed me afterwards was that for the case of Gibor, for the case of strong and self-mastery, I knew the answer. I just didn't carry the answer through consistently enough. My son pointed out that there's a volume in which they have collected philosophical material from Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto's letters. And in one of the letters, he says, what is holiness? What does it mean to say that something is kadosh, holy? And he defines kadosh in two words, bo, kodesh. To say something is holy is to say that in it is kodesh. If you like, you could define kodesh as, it's hard to define, the holy. To say it is holy is to say the holy is in it. In it. The picture is, you got a thing, Q, and something has projected into Q, and because that thing is projected into Q, I call Q holy. What could that thing be? It's got to be something higher, something more central, something closer to the purpose of creation. Now, my son said to me, apply the same principle of dividing God up into the principles of action. Apply that same thought to this. When you say God is holy, ask, which principle are you talking about? Which principle is holy? And then the answer to what it means will be, this principle has projected into it a higher principle. And in the principles of the Kabbalah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu refers to the principle next to lowest, and there are higher principles which project into that level, and which then give it its holiness. So it's the same pattern over and over again. Okay, I'm just making you aware of this because this is a very deep idea. And having mentioned a certain term, I want to just point out something which almost nobody knows. And you can use this. You can try this as a test on people with black yarmulkes and black hats and so forth and so on. There's a Hebrew phrase, Ha-Kadosh Baruch Hu. The Holy One, blessed be He. It's an Aramaic phrase, Kudsha Brichu. Kudsha, blessed be He. Many people think that they are equivalent. Many people think that the Aramaic is a translation of the Hebrew. It's not true. Because Kudsha in Aramaic is not Kadosh, it's Kodesh. It's Kodesh. It's the upper level, not the lower level. So in Aramaic, when you say Kudsha Brichu, you're saying Kodesh, blessed be He. Not holy, Kadosh, blessed be He. Okay, at any rate, that's just a mega digression on what we have here. With great awe, signs and wonders. Let's see how the Haggadah associates this with verses in Exodus. He took us out of Egypt. Hashem took us out of Egypt, not via an angel, and not via another type of angel, and not via an agent, I must comment, the word shaliach in Hebrew does not mean messenger, nor does malach, angel, mean messenger. Shliach in Hebrew means an agent, someone you appoint to do for you what must be done. It's a legal term. I can send you to the market to buy something for me. When you take possession of it, it becomes my property, not your property. It doesn't have to wait for you to bring it home and give it to me because you're acting as my agent. You could sign documents for me. You could betroth a woman for me. No, it wasn't done via these agents. Elo Kadosh Baruch Hu b'chvod v'atzmo. Kadosh Baruch Hu himself, with his honor, his own essence. As it says, and here we have to be careful. I passed through the land of Egypt in that night, and I struck every firstborn in the land of Egypt, from people to animals. And in all the gods of Egypt, I shall do judgments. I am Hashem. So now, each one of these personal pronouns, the Haggadah uses. I will pass through the land of Egypt at night. I, no angel. I will slay the firstborn in that land of Egypt. I, no seraph. Upon all the gods of Egypt, I will execute judgments. I, no messenger. I, Hashem, is I, and no other. Sounds very simple, very obvious. It isn't. Ramban has a very subtle understanding here. First of all, the Ramban says, our picture of how God operates, the picture that we are supposed to use to understand the mode of operation, is a picture of a king, and a king doesn't travel alone. A king doesn't travel isolated. A king travels with his whole retinue. The emphasis of the Haggadah here is God didn't simply remain distant and aloof and send his representatives to carry out the judgment, which is the normal procedure. The normal procedure. No, God appeared in Egypt, whatever that means exactly, appeared in Egypt himself, together with his retinue. Of course, he doesn't travel isolated, but the alternative would be that he should remain distant and simply send those representatives to carry out his will, which is the way he runs the world all the time. Grass grows because there's an angel that makes it grow. And the tides are obeyed because God sends angels to control the movement of the water. Everything is controlled by angels, and he's, so to speak, not personally involved, not immediately involved. He's represented by these agents. Here he is personally involved. And this becomes very important because the word that has given the name of the holiday has been grossly misunderstood. Passover, which is Pesach, as a verb, lifsoach. The picture I think that most people have in their minds is that God comes through the land of Egypt, killing the firstborn, and he passes over the Jewish houses and doesn't kill their firstborn. According to, I think Rashi says it this way also, and according to Ramban, that is a completely wrong picture. The picture is the exact opposite, and it's based on two explicit statements in verses. Because it says, I will be posach on your houses, and I will not allow the destroyer to come in. V'lo yitin v'mashchis mingo. Not allow the destroyer? Who's this destroyer? There is a destroyer? Oh, and God is saying, I will not allow the destroyer to come in or to strike. So that means God is performing a protective role, not a destructive role. There's something else called the destroyer, which of course is an angel. And that's performing the destructive role. Now, lifsoach in Hebrew doesn't mean to pass over. Lifsoach in Hebrew means to jump onto, to land on, not over but on. One classical reference to it is where Elijah is addressing the idol worshippers whom he invited to a contest in the Carmel Mountains to see whether the Baal will send down fire from heaven to devour the sacrifice, or whether the Creator, who Elijah is representing, will send down fire. And he says to the assembled company, Ad Masai atem poschim al shtei seifim. How long will you jump from one side to the other? Make a commitment. If you worship God 100%. Worship Baal 100%. I'm not here to explain that. But the phraseology is, how long will you jump from one side to the other? So the picture here is the exact opposite. The picture here is that God lets loose a destroyer, and as the destroyer makes his way through the population, when he comes to a Jewish house, God stands in the doorway and says, not here. You're not coming in here. God himself is playing the role of protector, defender. And that's in part why it says to the Jewish people, don't go outside. Don't go outside. Because God will not defend you outside. He'll only defend you if you're at home. You made the sacrifice, the Paschal sacrifice, you ate it, stay indoors. Okay, so when it says, I will pass an eye, not an angel, so forth and so on, it means it's I who am coming personally to direct the activities of that night. After all, Moses says to Pharaoh a couple of times, I'll leave the city and then I'll cry out to God. And the commentators say the city was so full of idols that prayer to God in that context either couldn't be heard, or it would be very difficult to be heard. There were no angels there to carry the prayer before God because it was so defiled. So the fool says, oh, it's so defiled that an angel can't go in. So then certainly God can't go in, because God is much holier than an angel. I call him a fool because there are no boundaries to God. There are no limitations on God. An angel is holy, and his holiness could be swamped by the pollution of Egypt, therefore he can't go in. God is even holier, but he's infinitely powerful, infinitely invulnerable. So he can appear there. And that's precisely what this is emphasizing, that God has no boundaries. And even the enormous spiritual degradation of Egypt is not going to stop him. Anyway, you can see here that the Haggadah is sort of subtly indicating a number of very important themes. And if I don't have a lot to say about another phrase, that's only because I don't know them, not because they aren't there. Okay, with a mighty hand, this is what we said before. This refers to the pestilence. That means the disease of the animals. As it says, behold, the hand of Hashem shall strike your cattle, which are in the field, the horses, the donkeys, camels, herds, flocks, very severe pestilence. Outstretched arm refers to the sword. As it says, his drawn sword in his hand, outstretched over Jerusalem. And the commentators point out, this is the only verse that's cited in the entire sequence that's threatening Israel. That outstretched sword over Jerusalem is not to protect Jerusalem, it's to attack Jerusalem. That would require some thoughts to why the authors of the Haggadah would cite a verse that's seemingly, negative to us. With great awe, alludes to the revelation of the Shekhinah. As it says, has God ever attempted to take unto himself a nation from the midst of another nation by trials, miraculous signs, wonders, war, and awesome revelations, as all that Hashem your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes? It means when the Shekhinah reveals itself, the first natural, fundamental response is awe. It may be accompanied by love, it may develop into love, but the first natural response is awe. With signs, refers to the miracles before the staff. Take the staff in your hand before the miraculous signs with it. Wonders refers to the blood. That will show wonders of heaven and earth, the heavens and earth. Now it quotes a verse from prophets: blood, fire, columns of smoke. Another explanation of the preceding verse: each phrase represents two plays. Hence, mighty hand is two, outstretched arm is two, great awe is two, signs and wonders, signs two, wonders two. That makes 10. These are 10 plagues, which the Holy and Blessed be brought upon the Egyptians in Egypt. Namely, I have the list of the 10 plagues. Maybe tomorrow we'll do the 10 plagues in detail. I want to just take a look at the next 3 paragraphs. Maybe that'll be enough for today. This is something which everybody knows, and I think people don't appreciate it correctly. Yosef clearly said, how does one derive the Egyptian was struck with 10 plagues in Egypt, or with 50 plagues at the sea? 50. Well, Concerning the plagues in Egypt, the Torah says, the magician said to Pharaoh, it is the finger of God. However, those who see, the Torah relates, Israel saw the great hand which God laid upon the Egyptians. People feared Hashem, and they believed in Hashem and the servant Moses. How many plagues did they receive with a finger? 10. Well, then, conclude they suffered 10 plagues in Egypt, where they struck with a finger. They must have made to suffer 50 plagues at the sea, where they struck with the whole hand. Psh, look at that. 5 times 1 is 5, so 5 times 10 is 50. Ain't that great? And then as it says, everyone in Egypt was 4, so it's 200. And Rabbi Akiva said, everyone in Egypt was 5, so it's 250. This is not, arithmetic for a 4-year-old. The key is not in finger and hand. Finger is 10, so hand is 50. That's not the key. The key is in the verse that's cited. Let's see what the verse says again. Israel saw the great hand which Hashem laid upon the Egyptians. The people feared Hashem and they believed in Hashem and in his servant Moses. This is recited at the sea. That's not recited about the Jews in Egypt when they saw the 10 plagues. So the verse is telling you what happened at the sea caused a much greater impact on the people than what happened in Egypt. That's the key. So the sea must be bigger. Now, how bigger was it? Okay, this is finger and this is hand, this is 1, this is 5, multiply, 10, 50. That's not the source of the idea. The source of the idea is this description of what happened to the people at the sea that didn't happen in Egypt. Now, there are those who comment, I don't know whether this is tongue-in-cheek or whether it's meant, how seriously it's meant, but at the beginning, before the plagues take place, it says, Vayamein ha'am, when Moses comes and declares his intentions and he shows them the 3 signs that God gave him at the bush, it says the people believed. Here it says that they believed in Hashem and in Moses. Believing in God is one thing, believing in a human being is another thing. And especially you're talking about the stiff-necked Jewish people, the fact that here they came to the point where they even believed in Moses, they accepted Moses, they trusted him, but okay, I'm not sure that that's 100% serious and important. Okay, now, Elazar and Rabbi Akiva take another verse and they read it in 2 different ways, which you could read it. Take a look in the last paragraph on page 39, 4 lines down. Here's the verse. He sent upon them his fierce anger, wrath, fury, trouble, a band of emissaries of evil. Now, you could read that, as Elazar does. He said upon the fierce anger, look how the translator punctuates the fierce anger, colon, wrath, fury, trouble, band of adversaries of evil. That means wrath, fury, etc. is explanation of the anger. Anger isn't part of the list. It's introduction to the list. And the list has 4 items. Rabbi Akiva doesn't take that. Look at this now, the translator did it good. Look at the next page, the 4th line down. For it is written, he sent upon them his fierce anger, now not a colon, but a comma. Fierce anger, wrath, fury, trouble, band of adversaries of evil, that's 5. Because you count fierce anger separately. Okay? Yeah, terrific. Okay, so you have this list of 5 things. If the first one in introduction is only 4, how do you count? That can't be it. That can't be the source of the idea. The source of the idea is that there are different names of God, and they have different numbers of letters. And the 2 most prominent names of God, one is spelled Yud and a Hey, and a Vav and a Hey, that's 4 letters. And the other one is Aleph, Lamed, Hey, Yud, Mem, which is 5 letters. And that's what Rabbi Gottlieb and Rabbi Akiva are talking about. Which name governs the process of the Exodus? So they found this verse in Psalms, and they divided it up. That's only a symptom. That's not the real source of the idea. Okay?
I just have a quick question about back in the Rabbi Yossi Gottlieb paragraph about that drasha on finger versus hand.
Yeah.
Because it says that it was the magicians of Pharaoh that said that.
Yeah.
Do we say that they had somewhat of a prophetic statement when they said finger, or do we say that God like paraphrased their words as like fingers?
No, I
They
understand them
literally
that
say
they really said that.
Okay.
And in fact, it was really true, even though Pharaoh didn't believe it when they said it. And he's using it now as a leverage.